Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, experts, guests, this is day 5 of the International Interdisciplinary Conference, The Role of Mentality in Human Life and Culture, dedicated to the studies of the unique phenomena of mentality. Mentality as a scholarly subject intersects a massive range of disciplines, studies related to business, management, marketing, communication, as well as intercultural studies, philosophy, psychology, history, geography, myth and folklore studies, anthropology, and criminology. Therefore, this conference brings together scientists, experts, researchers, and journalists from different fields of science and practice who have studied mentality, its role, manifestation, and influence in various aspects of our lives. I am sincerely honored and pleased to welcome everyone to the online panel of the International Conference arranged by the European Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. I am Iryna Lopatiuk, and I am glad to be your moderator today. So these are the 2 key discussion points of the current online session. The first question, the criminal environment as the basis for the formation of the mentality of criminals. And the second one, the influence of cities on human aspirations, symbol of the family or symbol of the city. So these are the questions. And now please let me introduce our speakers right in the way they are given the floor. Professor Jerome Krase, USA, Emeritus Professor, sociologist, Koppelman Professor, School of Humanities and Social Sciences, President of European Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, expert in sociology, gentrification in Brooklyn, Brooklyn ethnic groups, Italian-American politics, culture, race, class, urban life, and ethnicity in New York. One of his recent books includes Race, Class, and Gentrification in Brooklyn, A View from the Street. He is a public activist scholar and serves as a consultant to public and private agencies regarding urban community issues, co-editor of Urbanities and editorial board members of Visual Studies and CIDADES. We're pleased to greet you, dear Professor Jerome Krase. The next speaker is Dr. Oleg Maltsev, Ukraine. He is a world-renowned European scholar, head of the Memory Institute named after Grigory Popov, the author of exceptional scholarly works in criminology, psychology, and philosophy. He is a presidium member and academician of the European Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Dr. Maltsev is the head of the Expeditionary Corps, the prime department of the Memory Institute, which has been conducting field research worldwide for more than 8 years to explore how different nations and rulers attained power throughout history. My share greetings to Dr. Oleg Maltsev. The next speaker is Professor Dr. James Finkenauer, USA, organized crime expert, author, distinguished professor emeritus at Rutgers University, former director of the National Institute of Justice, Washington, D.C., academician of European Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Dr. Finckenauer is an expert in human trafficking, juvenile, and international criminal justice, author of numerous books on Russian organized crime in the U.S. We're pleased to have you together with us. So our next speaker is Dr. Stanton Samino, USA. He is a clinical psychologist licensed in the Commonwealth of Virginia. He specializes in juvenile and adult criminal behavior and in matters related to child custody and visitation. He has served as a consultant and expert witness for a variety of courts and agencies, including the FBI. Dr. Samino is an author of numerous books, including Inside the Criminal Mind and co-author of 3 volumes, The Criminal Personality. My share greetings to you. Our next speaker is Dr. Milergaard, France, an author, keynote speaker, board member, and entrepreneur, and he teaches at several universities and business schools around the world on global leadership, cross-cultural leadership, innovation, and entrepreneurship. He is the founder and CEO of Dudin, helping entrepreneurs and companies around the world to become more successful internationally. He has worked with more than 600 companies and entrepreneurs around the world, helping them become better at leveraging the opportunities and mitigating the risks of globalized worlds. And the next speaker is Professor Maxim Lepskiy, Ukraine, Doctor of Philosophy, Professor of the Chair of Sociology, Department of Sociology and Administration at Zaporizhzhia National University, Head of Research Board in Social Forecasting, Sociological Association of Ukraine, Academician of the European Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. So by this, I'm welcoming all the speaker. Let me please deliver just a few words about the reference terms of this panel. So we are discussing the first question, like in the first round, and then switching to the second question. And please limit the extent of your speeches up to 8 or 10 minutes, no longer than 10 minutes. And to begin with, we shall start the discussion on the first issue. The criminal environment as the basis for the formation of the mentality of criminals. And to begin with, I would like to give the floor to Professor Jerome Krase. You're welcome, sir. Please turn on your mic.
Hello, everyone. I'm very glad to be here today. Criminology, as you might know, is not my specialty. However, I've done some work in the field, and some of my training, I think, would relate to this issue. Also want to remind myself, at least, that we had somewhat of this discussion when we were talking about subcultures, and we had talked about criminal subcultures, which I think fits also in this area. We're talking about now the idea of the criminal environment. I would say simply the social environment as the basis for the formation of a criminal mentality, which again, after our discussion of mentality and attitudes, I would rephrase as a propensity on the part of individuals to involve themselves in criminal activity. Also understanding that criminal activity is a particular form of what we call in American sociology deviance or a violation of norms. I'd like to start off by saying this is kind of lucky of the timing for this discussion, because this week in my Introduction to Sociology course, we spent the week talking about deviance, or the violation of the rules, the norms of society in relation to the values of that society, which are extremely important. You know, if we're talking about criminality and violation of norms, there's a major impact, of course, on the societies and the cultures in which individuals exist as to what it is that they desire, and the means that they have or don't have available to them because of their particular situations to attain those particular goals. So what I did in my class, which I always do, try to involve my students, I learn a great deal from them, is I asked my students if they ever violated social norms at any level, right? Because what we tend to forget is that an enormous amount of the social activity in which we ourselves and other people are engaged in are in one way or another violation of those norms. And also, when I said to them at any level, I cautioned them not to tell me about crimes that they may have committed, explaining to them that crimes are violations of criminal law, in the most direct sense. And that I said, well, one of the reasons why I don't want them to tell me about crimes that they've committed, because I didn't want to become an accessory after the fact. Because at least in American law, there's a liability that one might have to have knowledge of the commission of a crime and to not to report it. All right, so I had to explain that to them. So we note, as my students did, and they explained to me all the violations that they have, it then became an issue for us to discuss, two kinds of things. Why did they violate the rules? Why might people commit a crime? All right, which has a great deal to do, as we see from the thrust of our discussions today, about the social worlds in which they live. So the criminal environment, it's not necessarily a criminal environment, it's a social environment in which, for one reason or another, the individual learns, right, learns to commit a crime. Now, I was trained at Indiana University, as many of you know, And I studied under Alfred Lindesmith, who was a well-known criminologist in social psychology. And our orientation towards criminology, which I studied in those years, was a major one from Edward Sutherland and Donald Krase, their principles of criminology, and especially the idea of differential association, which relates directly to what it is that we're talking about here. Because what they argued, and I agree based upon not simply my reading but my personal experience, that one's propensity to engage in activities, whether or not we believe they're criminal or not, it doesn't make any difference. It comes from our associations with others in our society. So we learn to be involved in criminal activity in the same way that we learn about how to engage in non-criminal activity, right? It's the same issue, right? And so it's not, for me, it's not a special area of study. It's a normal area of study. And from that, I went on to a research that I wished to engage in, I began to engage in, about Kurt Lewin's field theory, using Kurt Lewin's field theory, and study of capital punishment as a more or less of a deterrent for the commission of homicide in the United States. And this basically derives from the same differential association, but looking at it in a different way. And that is to say, well, how does the experience of criminals, how does their experience interacting with the law enforcement and judicial system affect their propensity to engage in criminal activities? And when I did reviews of the literature and did a bit of philosophical, logical work, etc., I came to the conclusion that the greater the interaction that a criminal has with the law enforcement and judicial system, the least likely they are to fear the legal system and the enforcement system. What they discover in the course of their activity is how easy in some cases it is, one, not simply to be detected, two, how to avoid arrest, and then what they find out is they find out that the system itself is not as, how should I say, frightening as it might be to a person who's never experienced the system. Okay, so the final thing I'd like to say is a follow-up to that. I've continued in this kind of work throughout my work, both in the academic world and the public world, having to do with criminal prosecutions of people and the law. And I have a friend of mine, a very close friend of mine, is the head of the public defense system for New York City. It's the providing what they call assigned counsel. Okay, and I asked him, in fact, I asked him today, because I knew I was going to be talking today, and I said to him, well, this is my experience, this is what I think, right? And his experience of 20 or 30 years of being a criminal attorney, and then also representing the city and providing assigned counsel to people who are charged with criminal offenses, he agreed totally with me that his experience with people facing criminal trials, being arrested and facing criminal trials, was basically the same thing, that the more involved, the more experiences that they had, the less likely they were to be afraid of being caught, of being prosecuted, of being convicted, and of being sentenced. And then also beyond that, what they discover, what he says, is their experience in prison life. Okay, it also leads them to discover, right, that they can do it. You know, they can last out, right? And so that's you know, in a nutshell, my 8 minutes of introduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor, for delivering your speech. And right away, let me please give the floor to our next speaker, Dr. Maltsev. You're welcome.
Здравствуйте, уважаемые дамы и господа.
Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen.
Наверное, сложнее всех на криминологической панели говорить криминологу.
Perhaps the most hard to make the speech on such a panel dedicated to criminology, being a criminologist.
Ну, уже 1000 раз все сказано, написано 300 работ, как бы уже одно и то же обсуждать всегда очень сложно.
There's been a lot already written on the topic, a lot of speeches made, and it's quite formidable to discuss more or less same things.
Да, то есть я, наверное, единственный на панели человек, помимо нашего президента Джереми Краса, который с этой преступностью сталкиваюсь каждый день. Джереми Крас уже перестал сталкиваться.
Probably I am one of the few persons on this panel who has to deal with this criminology, with this crime on a daily basis, because now Professor Jerome Krase is not very close related to that field anymore.
То есть, по сути своей, как бы я уже давно, активно не работаю.
I'm not actively working in this field since long.
Но у меня огромное количество учеников.
However, I have a large number of students,
да, которые каждый день ко мне приходят с новыми проблемами.
Who come every single day with their new problems and ask to resolve them.
То есть я занимался активной деятельностью более 20 лет.
So I've been actively engaged, like on the field, in this field for about 20 years in the past.
То есть как бы именно ежедневное противостояние преступности.
And when I say active work in the field, it is, dealing with the crime on a daily basis.
Да, и так как я, в общем, был эксперт независимый,
and since I was an independent expert during my activity,
то я, наверное, наиболее объективен, то есть я не занимаю ничью сторону ни правоохранительных органов, ни общества, ни преступности. Для меня это вот что-то сродни математической задаче.
And since I was an independent expert, as I've said, I do believe that my view is quite objective because I never took any side. I never took the law enforcement side or the side of criminals. For me, what I was doing is something like a mathematical equation that has to be resolved.
И я совершенно согласен с профессором Джереми Красом,
I totally agree with the Professor Jerome Krase,
что смертная казнь – это всего лишь психотерапия для общества.
That when we speak about the capital punishment, it is not something very effective. It turns out to be just like a psychotherapy for the entire society.
Да, ничего смертная казнь не решает.
That it doesn't really solve the problem in a nutshell.
То есть никакое наказание не решает вопроса преступности.
When we speak about the criminality, delinquency, there is no punishment that would really resolve the problem itself.
У нас с вами когда-то было страшное тоталитарное государство в виде СССР.
In the past, on the global scale, on the face of Earth, there was a horrible totalitarian state which was titled USSR.
И это было единственное государство, где не было преступности.
And that was the only state that had no criminality as such.
То есть просто в этом государстве быть преступником было ужасно.
Because being a criminal in USSR was just unbearable.
То есть никто в этом государстве преступником быть не хотел.
And nobody did aspire to be a criminal in USSR. I mean, it was not a role model.
92% преступлений раскрывались.
Because 92% of committed crimes were made transparent.
И люди, которые стояли у истоков борьбы с преступностью в этом организации, в этом государстве, были очень-очень высокообразованные.
And people who stood at the roots of resolving crimes, of looking into them, those people were very, very highly trained and educated.
И, в общем-то, по сути своей, успеха в борьбе с преступностью, такой, как добилась СССР, не добилась ни одна страна по сей день в мире.
And the success which was truly achieved by USSR in fighting criminality is incomparable even to these days.
То есть, как бы ее там просто не было, преступности в том виде, в котором мы ее себе представляем.
Because criminality in the form that we imagine today simply did not exist in Soviet Union.
Величайший теоретик, в общем-то, памяти, криминологии, как бы поведения человека Григорий Семенович Попов, академик.
Outstanding scholar Grigory Semyonovich Popov, who studied the memory of a human being, the behavior of a human being, the thinking process, and the way the criminals saw,
Очень хорошо разбирался, как это делается.
was very highly skillful in the ways of preventing crime.
То есть, как бы, чтобы преступность не предпринимала, как бы, все это заканчивалось ничем.
No matter what kind of endeavors the crime tried to start, they would end with nothing.
Да, это был настолько выдающийся человек, что он даже смог преступность поставить на службу государству.
Popov was so unique and outstanding, that scholar, that he was capable of making criminality serve the state.
Да, у нас есть преступники, государственные преступники, которые имеют офицерские звания и огромное количество правительственных наград.
And the history knows a lot of like criminals, state criminals, who end up having a lot of awards that were awarded by the state to them because of their accomplishments.
То есть этому человеку удавалось из преступников делать офицеров армии.
So, in other words, that scholar, he managed to transform those criminals into army officers.
Ну, он много чудес творил.
He did a lot of wonders.
Да. И, в общем-то, как только развалился Советский Союз, вроде демократия, капитализм и так далее, и наши государства превратились в самый жуткий криминальный вертеп сразу же.
And right after the collapse of the USSR, speaking of the former Soviet Union, it was supposed to be new capitalistic, democratic, new flourishing states. However, what happened is that right away, all those states have turned into horrible, very criminal environments that are unbearable to live.
Так вот, Григорий Семенович Попов, он считал, что есть две теории о преступниках.
And in opinion of Grigory Semyonovich Popov, he thought that there are two main theories when we speak about delinquents.
Первая теория – это о том, что человек рождается преступником.
His first theory is that any human being on this earth, he is already born with an attitude of a criminal.
То есть у него есть шанс стать человеком.
Meanwhile, every human being on earth has a choice and a chance to become a human being and not a criminal.
В силу системы воспитания.
Because of the upbringing which is given to the person.
И вторая идея, как бы, это не его идея, это идея, как бы, отца, как бы, криминалистики, одного из отцов криминалистики, Ламбразо.
And the second theory, which Popov adhered to, but the theory itself belongs to one of the founding fathers of the criminology, Lambrazo.
Да, что общество и некие врожденные, как бы, качества человека делают из какой-то части людей обязательно преступников.
That the society itself and certain innate qualities of a person will inevitably make a certain percentage of the society criminal.
То есть, но как мы видим, как бы, в общем-то, прав оказался Григорий Семенович Попов.
And as the time shows, Grigory Semyonovich Popov's theory seems to be the right one, that every human being is born with an attitude of a criminal.
Он в свое время нарисовал модель некую.
At one point of time, he drew a certain model.
То есть, где преступность изображена как трехэтажная, как бы, модель.
And he depicted the crime itself as a three-level structure.
И самая древняя, как бы, модель, она в самом низу, как бы, стоит.
The most oldest model stands on the very bottom of the model.
И это конфликт, ну, по сути, городов и деревни, ну, села, деревни.
And it's about, roughly speaking, a conflict between rural areas and urban places, cities.
Когда люди приезжают в города, как бы, а город их не принимает.
In other words, when people come to the city, let's say they relocate from the rural area and the city doesn't accept them, it resists them.
Ну, то есть, как бы, по сути, общество их не принимает. То есть они приехали откуда-то, и им в городе как бы не место.
So they, those people that come from rural areas, they feel themselves as outsiders because the city doesn't accept them.
Ну, и это основано, конечно, на двух разных менталитетах.
And the reason of this conflict is because of the foundation of the mentalities are so different. There are two conflicting mentalities.
Да, то есть, по сути, им нужно куда-то устраиваться на работу, а их на работу не берут.
I mean, in the real life, for instance, they would want to get a job and they're not given that job that they want.
И так как они привыкли жить несколько иначе, чем они живут теперь в городе, они решают эти вопросы каким-то преступным как бы способом.
And because they used to live in a different manner in the rural area, they start trying to provide for themselves and try to build their future in criminal ways because they're not given what they want.
И в Советском Союзе, вы помните, была такая, ну, система, что человек из села не мог приехать в город.
And speaking about the USSR, there was a very specific system that a person from a rural area, I mean, he was not allowed just to relocate in one day and become a city dweller. It was not possible.
Ну, то есть он не мог переехать жить в город.
He could not move without a specific reason.
И по сути своей вот это решало первый уровень вот этой криминальной системы, как бы.
And that rule in the Soviet Union that resolved that problem of the conflict between rural and urban places, which is on the bottom of the model drawn by Popov.
Два остальных уровня крайне сложные.
Two other levels of the models are more complex.
Дело в том, что второй уровень преступности – это принудительная преступность, так называемая.
Because the second level on the model, it is about coercive criminality.
Я приведу два примера.
And I'll give two examples.
Когда возникло итальянское государство, специальные системы как бы Испанской империи остались на юге Италии.
For instance, when an Italian state was formed, specific structures that used to function during the Spanish Empire still existed, kept their existence.
Но они оказались на территории другого государства.
However, the point is that those structures found themselves on the territory of an entirely different state, a new state, unified Italy.
То есть это люди, дворяне, оказавшиеся на территории другого государства.
So imagine Spanish nobility that find themselves on the territory of another state.
Ну и как вы понимаете, так как их основная специализация работа на чужой территории.
And since their main specialization was the skill, the capacity to work on other territories,
Да, то они вот всему миру показали, как это делается.
they did demonstrate the entire world. How is that done?
Вы получили мафию, каморру и ндрангету.
Because as the consequence of those political actions, we end up seeing the emergence of structures such as mafia, drangheta, and camorra.
То есть это люди были уважаемые люди и никогда не стали бы преступниками.
Back in the origin of those structures, those people were honorable people. They would never even thought of becoming criminals.
Но вот много лет эти организации являются преступными во всем мире.
However, it's been decades and decades that these structures in this world are considered and are criminal.
Второй пример.
Second example.
У меня есть близкий друг.
My very close friend.
Да. И он был очень порядочным человеком, он служил в армии, он был очень уважаемым членом общества.
I had a very close friend who was just a very law-abiding citizen.
И он вернулся с армии, как бы, и решил пойти работать в полицию.
And after his service in the army, he came back and decided to go to work for police.
Какой-то дурак ему в отделе кадров полиции сказал, что рядом с ним на одной личной клетке живет какой-то преступник, и поэтому они его не могут взять в полицию.
And for some reason, one of the idiots at the police structure, he said to him, we cannot employ you. We are not going to make you a policeman because in the building that you live in, there is a criminal who lives just near you.
И, в общем-то, этот парень обиделся и пошел искать себе работу.
And that guy who was rejected because of a very ridiculous reason got offended and went to start seeking another job.
А тут с распростертыми объятиями преступная группировка говорит, ну куда же ты только должен к нам идти, куда же ты еще можешь пойти?
And while he was trying to find another job, the organized crime encountered him and said, hey, what are you doing? You should not search for anything. Here we are. Come with us.
И мы получили одного из активных членов одной из самых знаменитых на постсоветском пространстве преступных группировок.
And as a consequence of that, what happened to that person? He became one of the brightest, in the quotation marks, representatives of a very powerful organized crime structure on the post-Soviet space.
То есть, по сути своей, этот человек бы никогда не стал преступником.
Initially, that kind of person, he would have never ever became a criminal.
Это глупое государство сделало его преступником.
But a very ridiculous, very foolish act and the governmental structure, the way they function, made him like coercively a criminal.
Я все время проводил исследования преступности с незапамятных времен до сегодняшнего дня на территории бывшего Советского Союза.
One of my researches was dedicated to investigating the origination and the development of the criminality, starting from the first days up until today to the modernity on the post-Soviet space.
И не было ни одного случая, чтобы государство не делало лучше преступников из раза в раз.
And I didn't see even one single case. It was all the same. Every state, every country was doing their best in order to make the criminals even better, even more sophisticated and more agile.
То есть государство сделало все, чтобы они стали сильнее, умнее, богаче и так далее и тому подобное. То есть это создавало все условия для того, чтобы преступность цвела гиацинтом.
So looking back to that like chronology of what the states did, I mean, they were creating, and maybe they are creating, all the conditions to make the criminality and organized crime more smart, more wealthy, more sophisticated, and just flourish.
Я не знаю, как в Соединенных Штатах Америки, я имею в виду, я не проводил этого исследования в США, я не знаю, как в Австралии, на территории бывшего Советского Союза, вот там, где союзные республики сейчас, это исторический факт.
I don't know what is the case in the territory of the United States of America and in other countries in the world. However, the thing that I research, post-Soviet space, it is just a historical fact.
И когда мы говорим о третьем уровне преступности,
Speaking of the third level of the criminality on the model that was depicted by Popov,
это конфликт между статусом и соответствием статуса.
it is about a conflict between a status that a person has and his correspondence. Give several examples.
Ну, вы, наверное, знаете, что чаще всего у богатых людей как бы дети как-то переносят вот эту власть и богатство на себя и становятся правонарушителями.
As it's often the case, usually in a very wealthy families, we have their kids take that burden of the power and wealth and start committing criminal acts.
Да, то есть часто так бывает, и это не всегда так, но очень часто случается.
Certainly that is not always the case, but it is very often.
Второй момент – это накопившееся чувство справедливости.
The second example is when there is accumulated feeling or sense of justice.
То есть, когда человек, подогретый средствами массовой информации, беззаконием государства и прочими вещами, берет, например, автомат, как бы и начинает стрелять во все, что не попадет.
When it is a certain, roughly speaking, it's a certain condition of a human being when he was fueled by what mass media has to tell him, and with the chaotic state in the state. So, for instance, that type of a person, he can just take a gun and start shooting anything that he sees.
Да. Также, в общем-то, делают дети, которые берут у папы пистолет из шкафчика, как бы идут в школу и стреляют в учителя.
This is an analogous example, which is done by kids. When they take his gun, the father's gun from the shelf, they bring it to school and start shooting people.
Да, так вот, когда мы говорим с вами о двух вторых уровнях, мы поговорили о первом, о конфликте вот этого села, деревни и города, да?
So we spoke about the conflict on the first level between the rural and urban areas.
То в Советском Союзе второй уровень был исключен.
Then when we spoke about the second level of the model, in the USSR, that level was just excluded. It was not even in question.
То есть советское государство было таковым, что оно все ставило себе на вооружение.
Because in the USSR, the government structure was in a way that they would employ everything for their own advantage, for the advantage of the people, of the nation.
Чего не умеют сегодня демократические государства.
Which today's democratic societies are not capable of.
То есть превращать преступников в полезных обществу людей.
They cannot transform criminals into citizens, into residents that would bring some use to the nation.
Да, то есть этого, к сожалению, не научилась делать ни одна страна в мире, кроме СССР.
Unfortunately, none of the countries is able or was able to accomplish this except the examples that I gave related to the USSR.
А третий уровень в Советском Союзе, он был настолько малочисленный, то есть он практически исключенный был.
And as for the third level in the model that we spoke about, the conflict between the status and correspondence to the status, that was very rare in the USSR. It was, but rare.
Что если мы находим исторические примеры, они единичны.
And even if we find some examples from the history, then we can just count them on our fingers.
Ну, то есть в Советском Союзе невозможно было, чтобы ребенок взял пистолет и пошел убил учителя.
I mean, just to give a simple example, it was not just possible in the Soviet Union that a kid would take a gun from his parents' shelves and go and try to shoot somebody or shoot a teacher.
И это не потому, что там Америка плохая, а Советский Союз был хороший, потому что это разные системы, которые по-разному построены в борьбе с преступностью.
And I'm not giving this example in order to say that, for instance, events that are happening in the US and the US itself is bad or the USSR is good. No, it's just this is our two entirely different structures, the way they're built in order to combat the criminality.
Кто такой гангстер в США?
For instance, if we look at the image of a gangster in the US, who is he?
Это серьезный парень, как бы, которому все завидуют.
He is a tough guy that many envy.
Кто такой гангстер в СССР?
And who is the gangster in the USSR?
Это человек, от которого отвернулось 99% общества сразу же. То есть это негодяй, которого все не переносят.
In the USSR, that would be a persona non grata. 99% of people would feel like as if they want to throw up when they see. I mean, basically, they betrayed. I mean, they don't want to deal with that person. They don't like.
То есть, если они его встретят на улице, они его с удовольствием сдадут в полицию.
And if somebody meets such a person outside, they would be very happy and take him to the law enforcement.
То есть, вот если в Советском Союзе был гангстер, он вынужден был скрываться за 10 лицами, прятаться под стол, и чтобы, не дай бог, никто об этом не узнал.
So in the case of a criminal, of a gangster in the USSR, if he was like that, then he had to hide under like 10 masks and live very, very low radar life in order to be safe or survive somehow.
В Америке гангстер – это уважаемый человек, который разъезжает на шикарном автомобиле, и все ему завидуют.
I mean, generally speaking, the image of a gangster in the US is a very serious, tough person who rides a fancy car and people envy him.
Найдите в Советском Союзе хоть один фильм, который бы как-то провоцировал население посмотреть на гангстера с другой стороны.
If we look at the cinematography that was shot back in the USSR, we won't find even one movie that somehow provoked a normal nation in order to look up to that figure.
В Америке про гангстеров сняты самые знаменитые фильмы и самые кассовые.
And if we look at the American cinematography, then the movies that we see about the gangsters, there are certain like one of the most sensational movies that were made for them.
То есть, подводя итог моего рассказа, мы можем сказать, что профессор Крас безусловно прав. То есть, по сути своей, вся проблема в том, как устроено общество.
And to conclude my speech, I do believe that what Professor Jerome Krase noted is completely correct, that it's about the structure of it's a social environment that produces criminals. So the problem is in its structure.
И в политике государства.
And in the policies that are set by the government.
Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you for attention.
Thank you so much, sir, for delivering your speech. Right now, let me please give the floor to the next speaker, Professor James Finkenauer. You're welcome. Please turn on your mic.
All right, thank you very much. When I listen to Dr. Maltsev, I think I should put all my notes aside and just respond to a number of issues that he has raised. But I won't try to do that. I'll go in my own direction. And also Professor Krase, I mean, the whole Sutherland thing, I look down here, halfway down my page, I see the name Edwin Sutherland. So you're going to get some repetition in this discussion. Just to start, after I had been invited to participate in this panel, I was reading a book review in the New York Times, and it's a book about the book Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. And this caused me to rethink that. I read Crime and Punishment a number of years ago, and I thought, anyone who really would like to have an initial exposure to the mind of the criminal, a good place to start would be to read Crime and Punishment and get inside the head of Raskolnikov, or who's the protagonist in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. And I recommend anybody who's not read it, I highly recommend reading it if you're interested in the mind of the criminal and so on. Anyway, that said, thinking about the criminal environment, and some of this will pick up on what Professor Krase has also said. As is true with most, if not all, human behavior, we're products of both nature and nurture. And the nurture part he made reference to in terms of criminal behavior being learned. And this was the theory that the criminologist Edwin Sutherland propounded. He called the theory differential association. And what he meant by differential association is that all of us in our socialization process as we're growing up have the occasion to associate with different kinds of people. And in those associations, we take on some of the same values and attitudes and so on of the people with whom we associate. If, he says, the people that a young person growing up with tends to propound criminal values and criminal attitudes and so on, then it's not surprising that those attitudes and those values would be taken on by the new person who's growing up in that environment. And he says this is the way criminal behavior is learned. And it has actually several aspects to it. It's not just the attitudes, the justifications, if you will, for committing certain kinds of crimes and the rationalizations for that and so on. It's also the techniques, how to do certain kinds of things, how to cite, you know, if you start with young juvenile offenders, how do you siphon gas? How do you commit sort of low-level crimes? How do you take advantage of situations? Where do you find your victims? If you want to do pickpockets, where do you go to find the best places? Ball games or other crowded areas and so on. How do you do this and how do you get away with it and so on? So all of that, Sutherland said, is a learned process. So they start basically from zero and go through this process of learning this, and it's very much due to peer influence. And to give you an example about the peer influence, before I became an academic in the field of criminology, I worked in a correctional institution for juvenile offenders. And we used a method in this institution called guided group interaction, which is kind of a peer counseling idea. And it built on the notion that these young boys, these were 16 and 17-year-old boys, for the most part, got involved in delinquency because they got involved with other boys, very much like Sutherland said, other boys who supported those kinds of ideas and engaged in those sorts of activities. The idea of this program in which I worked was to reverse that process, to try to instill through peer pressure pro-social values. Now, what that entails is that the boys who are engaging in the criminal activity were being rewarded for that engagement. They were being rewarded by having status in their peer group. And we all know that teenagers, adolescents in particular, very oriented toward their peers, very much looking to have peer support and get status with their peers and so on. So the idea of the program was, can we flip that upside down so that they gain their status and their support through the peer pressure to be pro-social? And we found, by the way, that in 80% of the cases, yes, we could do that successfully. Now, these were not hardened offenders. They were young men who had committed, they weren't violent offenders, et cetera. So it wasn't the worst of the worst, and they weren't very much marginal in terms of the ability to influence them. And that had something to do with their success. But this notion of learning new attitudes and learning new behaviors is very important in this nurturing part of this process. Another element that comes out of that is another project I worked on was a study of legal socialization among American kids and Russian kids. We did a comparative analysis of these kids, both before and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, to see whether that had any change on the legal socialization of the kids in Moscow, where we were doing the sampling after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And one of the things that came out of that research was how kids learn about rules and laws, and what kind of obligation do they learn not to violate rules and laws, and how important is that to them? And basically what legal socialization theory says is you can classify people into three categories. They're in terms of law abidingness, why they obey the law. Some people obey the law because they're afraid of getting punished. They don't want to get caught. They don't want to get punished. They're deterred by having the law. A second group of people feel it's their obligation to live in a civil society, a lawful society in accordance with the rule of law, to obey the law. That people, you have to obey the speed limits when you're driving, for example. You have to stop at stop signs. Why? Because we have to protect each other in a civil society. We have to follow the law. We have to follow the rules and so on. And that's another avenue. Now, what does that say about learning? Kids have to learn what the laws and the rules are. They also have to learn the respect for them and why they need to be followed. And they need to move beyond a self-interest that I'm in a hurry to get somewhere, therefore I should be able to drive just as fast as I need to get where I want to go, versus the fact I'm putting other people's lives in danger if I choose to do that. And therefore, my obligation is to obey the law and to follow the rules. It's all part of a learning process. It comes through role modeling also. Initially, children from their parents. To what extent do the parents not only do what they say they do, or say as they do and do the same thing. They're following their own rules. They're following their own precepts, as opposed to saying one thing and doing something else. And then when they move to that second level of their peers, it's the same idea. They're gonna follow their peers in terms of the kind of support they get for whatever behaviors they're engaging in. Why? Because they want to belong. We all want to belong to some social setting and social society and be accepted and have some status. So we're willing to do what we feel we need to do in order for that to happen. So the peer pressure notion is extremely important. One other point that comes out of the legal socialization research is there's a guy by the name of Tom Tyler who's studied something called procedural justice. And when Professor Maltsev was talking, he's talking about the connections or the relationships between how people deal with law enforcement. What Tyler has been able to demonstrate is that there's a reciprocity between how people are treated by the criminal justice system and how they view the criminal justice system. If, for example, the cop stops you on the corner and the cop is very courteous to you, explains why you're stopped, gives you an explanation that is willing to listen to what you have to say about it, you form a different notion about the status and the legitimacy, if you will, of that police officer than if you paid no attention to, no opportunity to offer any explanation, not given any reason to have your own views presented at all. And you can go up the line with it. Same thing in the courtroom. If a judge listens carefully to what somebody has to say, shows them some respect, takes account of their views, even in Tyler shows, interestingly, even though the people may get punished up to subsequently, they take it more willingly because they feel like they've been in a fair, legitimate process. They had their day in court, so to speak, and therefore they're more willing to go along with this and to be structured by this and to live by this, which tells us something about. I used to work in police training programs, training police officers, and I would say to them, you, the police officer, have hundreds of these contacts perhaps every day. This person you're talking to right at this minute may have never had a contact with a police officer in their life. This is the first time they've ever been directly confronted with a police officer. So that experience to them means a great deal. And the demeanor of that officer and what they say and how they treat them and how fair they are and all that sort of stuff is going to be very, very important to that individual. Now multiply that across all the contacts and all the individuals, and you see how those relationships come about. And all of that goes into the learning of behavior, and whether that behavior that's being learned is criminal that will be pursued or whether it's non-criminal. The other category, to go to the nurture side, that's all, or to the nature side. All of this is by way of nurture. This is the growing up and the environment and so on. To go to the nature side, the idea that there's something, and Professor Maltsev mentioned this, as a born criminal is a very controversial notion. We're very fortunate to have Professor Samenow on this panel, who probably knows more about this than anybody I know of in terms of whether there is such a thing and what that thing is and so on. But this idea that some people are just born bad, when I think about that, I have a hard time thinking that that's actually the case. When I see these little babies, we watch a show called The Midwife, which shows babies being born every week. It's on PBS. It's hard to think when you see that little baby that that's a born criminal. What is it about that has criminal tendencies already? But if you were to push me in the direction of is that possible, the word that comes to mind is psychopaths. That there's something about psychopaths that give them a propensity for criminality. Now, interestingly enough, not all psychopaths are criminals, just as not all criminals are psychopaths. There are, if anybody has ever bought a used car, or ever gone to some other sale occasion, I think some of those people are actually psychopaths in terms of what they're willing to say and do whatever they need to say and do, irrespective of the truth of it or the impact on the person that they're saying to, just to get to the end that they want to achieve. That's the definition of a psychopath. Psychopaths lack empathy. They're not able, I was going to say willing, but I think it's more able as opposed to willing to put themselves in the position of the victim. They don't see the victim. They don't see how the victim is going to be harmed and hurt by what it is that they're going to be doing. They don't have any sense of that, and therefore are willing to engage in whatever they need to do. The heck with the victim. One of the questions that we asked of the American kids and the Russian kids in our survey was, do suckers deserve to be taken advantage of? This was an item that they was supposed to respond to. Now, interestingly, by the way, and I'll leave this to the Russian translator folks on this panel. The Russians told me that there is no comparable Russian word for sucker. So when they translated it and we back translated it into English, it came out to say people who are sloven deserve to be taken advantage of. Do you know you folks know the word sloven? You know the word sucker, first of all. You know what a sucker is? Okay. The word sloven to me means somebody who's messy or unkempt or whatever. It's a different notion than that somebody, because of their own foolish mistakes or being in the wrong place at the wrong time or something that they have done themselves, put them in the position to being victimized. And therefore, I, the person who's going to victimize them, are not really guilty. They're the ones responsible for what I'm doing. I'm not responsible for this. They should have taken care of their car. They should not have left the keys in their car. They should not have left their pocketbook where they left it. They should have done this, right? Otherwise, see, they did that to me. They made me a criminal because they left their keys in the car. This is the rationalization that goes on, particularly, I think, with people who would fall into this psychopathic category. But I will leave that to Professor Samenow, again, who I believe knows a lot more about this than I do. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Finckenauer. And right away, of course, I'm going to give the floor to Professor Stanton Samino. You're welcome, sir. Please turn on your mic.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So I am one of these people that actually deals with the criminal mind. I am a forensic psychologist, and I see people who have committed all sorts of crimes from all sorts of backgrounds. When I began this work, I joined a doctor at a large psychiatric facility in Washington, D.C., Dr. Samuel Yokelson. When I started in this work, I believed that criminality was largely due to the social environment that a person grew up in. The project that I was part of lasted 17 years. It was the longest in-depth research treatment study that, to my knowledge, has ever been done of offenders in North America. It was of men from a whole variety of backgrounds, and in terms of crimes, you name it, we had it. And so in the beginning, I believed that poverty, unstable neighborhoods, peer pressure, bad examples, that the environment was critical to the formation of a criminal personality. However, the first chapter of the 3 volumes, The Criminal Personality, is called The Reluctant Converts. It does not refer to the criminals that Dr. Yokelson and I were dealing with. It refers to us, how reluctant we were to take our sacred theoretical cows to pasture and slaughter them. What we found about the social environment was that, of course, after the fact, criminals will blame anything and everything as causal. But if you really take what we found, we had an attorney general in the 60s, Ramsey Clark, who said poverty is the fountainhead of crime. Now, we know that most poor people are not criminals, and many well-to-do ones are. Crime knows no social, economic, ethnic, racial, or educational boundaries. And yes, I have interviewed scores of offenders who have come from terrible environments, gang-ridden, drug-infested neighborhoods, where yes, there were some terrible role models. Yes, where there were endless temptations. Yes, where there was peer pressure that is almost hard to imagine. But guess what? Most of the people in those environments, the environment created problems, but what has impressed me more and more over all these years, 43 years of doing this, is not the environment that a person comes from, but how he chooses to deal with whatever that environment is. So let's talk about one of the men in our study. And there are many, many examples. And he did come from a part of Washington, D.C. that as a tourist, you probably wouldn't visit, the far southeast, where there were all sorts of drug problems. You could get access to firearms. There were gangs, and you name it, and he had done it. So we interviewed his sister, who came from the very same family. And we asked her, why is it with a father who's in prison, a brother in jail, and the guy we were talking to who had been declared, in quotes, not guilty by reason of insanity for his crimes, why is it that you didn't follow the examples within your own family and within your own neighborhood? Why did you not succumb to the temptations that were around you? She answered in 3 words: I wasn't interested. So the conditions were there. But what happened is that as she grew up, she looked around, she lived her life, and she made a series of choices as to whom she wanted to be like and whom she did not want to be like. Now, if this woman had become a prostitute, a junkie, and a thief, people in my field, psychology, and the related disciplines would say, well, of course, look at the terrible social environment, look at the pressures, look at the parents. But that is not what happened. So what might be called by sociologists risk factors, namely the ones I identified, the poverty, the dislocation, the instability, the bad role models, they were, in a sense, opportunity factors because she made a series of choices as she grew up. Now, we know, of course, that people come from very wealthy families, and they have not known the kind of grinding poverty and the same kind of instability. And we have had a very well-known case in the United States some years ago. It was called affluenza, that somebody turned to crime because he was spoiled and his parents didn't teach him right from wrong. So you name it, and anything can be a cause. I have a collection of articles that name anything and everything except the US federal deficit as a cause of crime. Let's talk about peer pressure. And I could go on with this for hours, and I'm trying to respect the time limit here. So peer pressure, of course, it's a fact of life, from womb to tomb, from preschool playgroups on into adult life. And yes, of course, people want to belong and they want to be accepted. But the question is, whom do they choose for peers? What kind of group do they want to belong to? And I remember the 14-year-old who said, to be like my brother, to be home after school, to do my homework, and to play basketball, that's like being a dog on a leash. What he wanted was a group of peers who were doing a lot more exciting things, who were hanging out, skipping school, going into stores, stealing from stores. He made the choice, or a series of choices to be more accurate, as to whom he wanted to be with, and he rejected the more conforming peers as being, and this is colloquial English, lame, sissies, or weak. Now, am I saying that the environment has nothing to do with crime? I'm not saying that. The environment can provide greater or fewer opportunities for crime, greater or lesser deterrence. When Richard Nixon was president of the United States, at one point, he wanted to beef up the DC police force. And what he did was to put a policeman practically on every corner. Crime went down in certain neighborhoods. But then we started to hear about suburban crime. The criminal didn't change. He just went to other areas where he had more opportunities. So again, there can be deterrence, but the criminal mind doesn't change. He seeks out other opportunities. Last statement, until I get to speak again, is this. So, am I saying that they are born this way? And Professor Finckenauer mentioned this. There are a lot of aspects of the human condition that we do not know the cause or causes of. I cannot say that people are born that way. We don't know that. There is more and more information that's coming out about a possible connection between biology and violent behavior. So what we did in our study, and what I still say, is this. In understanding crime and in understanding the criminal, we need to understand the thinking patterns. How do these people think? Behavior is a result of thinking. And so my focus, it's like a scratch on the table. You don't have to know why the table is scratched. You don't have to know how it got to be that way, but you do have to know what the table's made up of so you can make some decisions about what to do. Therefore, crime is a result of how the criminal thinks. Why did he get to be that way? Disagreement goes on.
Thank you so much, Professor, for delivering your speech. Right now, I'm pleased to give the floor to our next speaker, Dr. Finn Milergaard. You're welcome, sir. Please turn on your mic.
Thank you. I hope it works, and I will try to keep it short. As I can see, we are far behind schedule. I was very happy to hear you, Jim, mentioning Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, because that's one book I recommend to all my students as well. And right after that, I tell them to read Michel Foucault's Crime and Punish, because he's somehow related to Dostoevsky. Well, my take into this is from a cultural perspective. I've studied all sorts of cultures and how cultures develop and how cultures influence the individual and how cultures form the groups. We work with a lot of companies around the world, and some of the companies we're working with, they have challenges about changing behavior in these companies, because a culture can very easily create criminals in a corporation, that it becomes accepted doing criminal things like bribery or things like that. It's a different kind of crime that you were talking about, Stanton, but it's still crime, and it's about what's acceptable and not acceptable. So what we have seen working with changing cultures and trying to change people within that culture is that most of the people who are committing bribery or using child labor or things like that, they feel that they are in a kind of a dilemma. All cultural behaviors we have and all changes of behaviors we have in a culture is all about dilemmas. Should you follow the rules, or should you value the relationships, or what is accepted behavior in order to achieve status in a culture? Is it okay to break the rules? Is it okay to commit crime? Is it okay to bribe a customer in order to become the best salesperson in the company? All that kind of stuff is going on in the heads of these people who are committing these crimes in companies today. And we have seen it a lot with economic crimes in big financial institutions. I bet they were doing it because they were trying to achieve a higher level of status in the organization. And when you have a culture like that, where the goal is everything, that making as much money as possible is the most important thing, and no matter how you get there, nobody cares. That fosters the mentality of crime in a corporate environment. And how do you actually change that? That is often the case where we come into a company and try to help them finding out, how do we change that behavior? How do we change that culture? Because the sad thing is, Stanton, you were talking about that people were making a choice, that you can choose not to become a criminal. And I know you have a lot of research behind that, but I also know that the people that we are talking to, that they feel that they are in that dilemma, that they know they're doing something wrong, they know they're breaking the law, they know that they are behaving immoral, but they're doing it because it's so important for them to achieve status in the organization, so that they're willing to take that choice. And of course, it is their choice. But for some of them, it's a very difficult choice. Another thing we have seen is when it comes to crime and criminal environment, that there are actually two scenarios here. One where the criminal is walking into the criminal environment, and the other scenario is where the criminal environment actually moves into to the space or the culture where people are, so that a behavior that wasn't criminal yesterday suddenly becomes criminal today. We have seen it with the Me Too movement, that Harvey Weinstein, that the way that he behaved 30, 40 years ago was the norm in the film industry, is suddenly not the norm today, and it's a crime. Another thing we have seen is that whether a thing is a crime or not is very relative. For instance, when you look at freedom fighters during the World War II, for instance, for the Nazis, they were criminals and they were punished. But for the nationals where they were fighting for freedom, they were freedom fighters. So it's very much about perspective. So it's a very complex area, and we are working with it from a cultural perspective, and it's so complicated, and I think it's really hard to find one truth and one solution. So that's why I'm very excited listening to you guys here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your informative speech. And this is the moment I give the floor to our next speaker, Maxim Lepskiy. You're welcome.
Спасибо большое, уважаемые коллеги. Очень интересное выступление. Спасибо за приглашение. И хочу остановиться на нескольких тезисах. Первый тезис – это по поводу социализации молодых людей в советском обществе и почему это снижало криминальную среду и как вообще вот это воспринималось часто молодыми людьми.
So first of all, Maxim Lepskiy greets all the speakers, and he's happy to be here with you, and he's grateful for being given the floor. And he's going to share with us several theses. So the first very thesis is all about the young generation socialization process that took place back in USSR. Especially, we're going to speak about the way the criminal environment actually influenced upon the perception of youngsters and how they felt towards the criminality aspects.
Первое – это была создана система социальных институтов, которые канализировали агрессию.
So first of all, we should say that in the USSR, there was a system of social institutes that canalized and that actually decreased that criminality atmosphere, or let me say sense.
Во-первых, были использованы такие методы, которые раньше были у скаутов в пионерской организации.
There were, especially for the younger generation, there were special methods used, like the scout method, so-called. Actually, in USSR, that was called the pioneer.
И эту идею в свое время предложил один из известных разведчиков Оралов.
Moreover, this idea was firstly introduced by, let me say, well-known Oralov officer.
Его можно увидеть на памятнике Мустафе Кемалю Ататюрку в Турции. Он стоит прямо за спиной у Ататюрка.
And that person, actually, Oralov we're talking to, he's standing right, we can see him on the monument dedicated to Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who is the great figure in Turkey. So this person is standing right behind his back.
Вторая система была непосредственно с этим связана. Это безусловно, комсомольская система, и там были оперативные комсомольские отряды.
The second system above the system of pioneering or pioneering, so the second system was the Komsomol system.
Поскольку боевыми искусствами, кроме бокса и борьбы, такими как самбо, карате, кроме как в оперативных комсомольских отрядах, заниматься было запрещено.
And we should be emphatic upon the fact that such martial arts systems like boxing, wrestling, not like specific contemporary wrestling, by like sambo, karate, etc. Only the operative groups of Komsomol were allowed to take these martial arts.
И чаще всего эти оперативные отряды возглавляли майоры или подполковники милиции с большим авторитетом.
And usually these Komsomol units, they were headed by police or military colonels. I mean, by these people who shared the great authority. Everyone respected them greatly.
Вторая система или третья система была связана с подготовкой к ГТО, готовкой к труду и обороне, и спортивной деятельностью.
So the third system was actually connected with such a unit that was ready for working and for defending.
И в этой системе стать известным спортсменом – это была очень хорошая социальная карьера.
And speaking about this third system, we should say that the perspective of the sportsmanship career, that was one of the best ideas and one of the best life vectors that could be ever chosen.
Не менее интересной системой была, безусловно, армия и спецслужбы.
Of course, we should definitely speak about such nonetheless peculiar systems as army and special units are.
Если пацан не служил в армии, если парень не служил в армии, то он уже в статусе терял у окружающих очень многое.
And as a matter of fact, if back in the USSR there was a young man who didn't serve in the army, well, he lost so much in his social status respect. He wasn't even perceived like a real man.
Когда Советский Союз развалился, то эти каналы социализации, агрессии в перспективную деятельность были нарушены.
And of course, after the collapse of the USSR, we should say that these four-level socialized units canals, the canals that help to socialize the aggression, they were destroyed.
Если раньше была целая программа, чтобы земля горела под ногами преступников, то теперь преступники стали авторитетными людьми в обществе.
And speaking about the USSR period, we should say that there was like the whole structured state-level program. And due to that program, the society perceived the criminals like the worst mobsters, the worst human beings ever existed in the world. However, after the USSR collapsed, we should say that criminality raised on the authoritative hierarchy, and they started getting perceived as the best authorities ever.
И только начиная с 90-х годов в социологии и криминологии стали внимательно изучать американские и другие концепции криминологии.
And as a matter of fact, after the 90s here, sociologists and criminologists, they started to get acquainted, they started to research the other ideas of criminology, the American tendencies and so on and so forth.
Поскольку появилась потребность разобраться с подобными явлениями, которые уже были изучены.
And actually, these types of research was thrived due to certain necessity, the necessity to know the reasons, the necessity to find the solutions.
Но в менталитете советского была достаточно понятная сборка правильного пути и ухода с правильного пути.
However, again, speaking about the mentality of the Soviet, raised person, there was a very clear understanding and comprehension of what is wrong and what is right, what is the wrong path in your life or the right choice in your life, and what's never going to be that right.
Не менее важным было отсутствие такого большого разрыва между верхним слоем населения, децелем, и нижним децелем.
Moreover, there wasn't such a tier between the several levels of the society, like the lower decile and the upper one.
Если в Советском Союзе инженер получал 115 рублей, а первый секретарь обкома порядка 450, а рабочие на заводе 6-го разряда до 500 рублей, то разрыв был минимальный.
Okay, as for the wages, we should say, for instance, like the engineer, usually the wages of the Soviet engineer was like 115 rubles. The wages of the first secretary of the USSR was like 450 approximately. The wages of the very good worker on the plant, it was like 500 rubles approximately.
Профессор,
So everything felt fair.
Профессор получал 450 рублей, что на 50 рублей меньше, чем руководитель области.
Moreover, the wages of the ordinary professor was 450, and that was only 50 rubles less rather than the head of the region in the whole country.
Начиная с 90-х годов этот разрыв увеличивался не в проценты, а в разы и в десятки раз.
After the 90s of the 20th century, we should say that this wages difference, it started to get more and more distinctive, not in percent level, but in dimensional level, like 10, 100 times more.
Не менее важным было падение статуса сотрудника правоохранительных органов.
And of course, one of the most significant tendencies was the loss of the status of a police officer or the law enforcement officer.
Что присутствовало в культуре книг, кинофильмах и в другой масс-культуре.
And that tendency is reflected strikingly and dramatically both in books, in movies, and in other pieces of culture.
И тут была такая же тенденция, как во Франции после Второй мировой войны.
And this tendency could be claimed to be analogous or identical with the tendency of French culture right after the World War II.
Роман Гори, советник де Голля, писал о том, что романтизация американских гангстеров была основной для формирования французской молодежи послевоенного периода.
And Roman Gary, who was also the advisor and solicitor of Charles de Gaulle, he would say about the romanticization of the gangsters. That romanticization tendency was the most striking for the French youngsters.
Подобная ситуация была в 90-х и начало 2000-х в постсоветском пространстве.
The same situation, the same tendency actually covered the post-Soviet space.
Сейчас не менее интересными тенденциями является наличие трансформирующих событий, таких как пандемия, социальной дистанции, и цифровое неравенство.
Nowadays, we're experiencing the other two tendencies, like that are dictating certain social transformations, like the pandemics with all that social distancing and so on and so forth, and the digital inequality.
Социальная общность несколько разряжена, и люди общаются в онлайн.
As a matter of fact, contemporary society is discharged socially, and we are mostly communicating online.
Те ребята, у которых цифровое неравенство, то есть нет хороших компьютеров, хороших девайсов, они больше склонны к криминальным технологиям, и у них это получается.
And consequently, those young people who are experiencing social inequality, who don't have good PCs, no laptops, and the other internet devices, they are more, capable of getting influenced by the criminal skills. It's more, they are getting criminals more often.
Мой коллега и друг Олег Викторович Мальцев втянул меня в криминологию, и мы сейчас делаем еще один интересный проект.
My friend and my colleague, Dr. Maltsev, involved me in one of the most peculiar criminological projects.
Сейчас мы хотим посмотреть, откуда молодежь студенческая узнает о криминале и какие основные образы присутствуют у этой молодежи.
Right now, we are going to research how the contemporary young generation, what are the fields or the sources they are knowing the criminals. This is how do they know about the criminals and what are the images of the criminals they are getting magnetic to.
Сейчас мы проводим фокус-групповое исследование в Турции, Грузии и в Украине.
And we are researching several focus groups in Turkey, Georgia, and Ukraine.
И Турция.
In Turkey, Georgia, and Ukraine, sure.
С результатами, надеемся, познакомим, когда уже они будут обобщены. Спасибо за внимание.
And of course, we're going to share the results of this project and this research soon after this research is over. So thank you so much for sharing your viewpoints, Dr. Lepskiy, Professor Lepskiy. Thank you so much for your kind attention, dear speakers. And this is the high time. We're switching to our second discussion point and second discussion question. Let me please announce that one. So we're going to speak about the influence of cities on human aspirations, about the symbol of the family or the symbol of the city. And right away, I'm happy to give the floor to Professor Jerome Krase. You're welcome.
Okay, I'm going to speak as quickly as I possibly can. Thanks for all the information here. First of all, I want to say, as with white-collar crime, you learn to be a criminal with both the pre-socialization that takes place in the family, but also in the schooling, especially in graduate school of law and business. So we must include the higher levels of crime in our analysis as well. When we talk about what criminals have learned from their experience, also with law enforcement at all levels, as white-collar criminals frequently find out that they can get away with almost everything except murder. And now, in reference to what Professor Samenow have talked about, I'm glad he spoke because I grew up in those environments, my old neighborhoods, which I might say reminds me of a film that I saw where two kids are chased down an alley after they've committed a crime by a cop. And one of them is too short to climb over the fence. He becomes the criminal, and the one that is tall enough to climb over the fence becomes a priest, So yes, it is true that some of our personal, physical, as well as mental and other kinds of experiences kind of influence whether or not we decide, as he talked about making choices, how to deal with the situation. Also remembering, as he does, that choices and abilities to actualize our choices are socially constructed. They're not available equally to everyone. Now, in the first case of this urban environment, I was living in a low-income housing project, Red Hook in Brooklyn, and my oldest brother, Steve, was a member of a local gang. And the gangs in those areas were violent gangs, and many of them were involved in drug dealing. Now, his experience with that gang led him to be against criminal activity, because as he related to me, he was sitting on a park bench playing cards with another friend, and noticed that another friend on the other side of him, sitting next to him, had just died of a drug overdose. And that experience, as he related to me, led him down the path that, like Jim Finckenauer talked about. My brother Steve became a counselor also in the Spofford Juvenile Detention Center as one of his activities. I also should note, as Maxim was talking, that my brothers were in the Golden Gloves, the boxing association in New York City, as well as the police athletic leagues, which were sports activities that were intended to be diversions from juvenile delinquency, and where the goal was to get people to get certain kinds of understandings and to obey the law. But remember, obeying the law is also dependent upon one's self-interest, as some others mentioned, deterrence, or what I would have talked about in terms of mentality, the organic solidarity, the realizing that by not involving in crime, we live in a world that we would prefer to live in such a world, so we don't commit to it. Now, I want to mention the second case, second environment in which I live, and that was in a different area where in the very corrupt police precinct that was mentioned in the New York City Knapp Commission hearings, it's the 80th precinct that I live nearby, which also, by the way, was interesting that as corrupt as they were running a police athletic league diversion programs. Alongside the police in the same area was a local organized crime, Italian organized crime group, which looked at those same children, the same youngsters who were in these diversion programs, looked at them as potential people to recruit for their organized crime organization. They were looking for good prospects on the streets. And so I have to tell you, in that particular environment, there was also the kind of a bifurcation of friends that are a little complicated, all right? Because some of them went into organized crime. Some of them didn't go into organized crime, like myself. I guess I was like the short person. But then also some of them went into the police department because what they learned in their experience on the street was that the police officers were benefiting by being involved in organized crime, right? So here we see it's not simply one way or the other. There's also a middle way that exists in our society where people actually go into law enforcement. Again, it's not a large proportion of people, but people who involve themselves in law enforcement and judicial systems from the point of view actually engaging in the violation of the law, not in the supporting of the law. Okay, and we've also seen that in terms of correction officers, etc. So those complicated cases, I think Professor Samenow would be very, very interested in investigating those kinds of people. Because it's not such an easy switch, in terms of understanding the choices that they made and how they made those choices. So I'll end there and hope that everybody else is as brief as I am.
Thank you so much, Professor. So I'm giving the floor to Dr. Oleg Maltsev.
Ну, вряд ли у меня получится быть коротким, в общем-то, после того, что я услышал.
I don't think I'm going to succeed in being very brief as Professor Jerome Krase after what I have heard on this panel.
Ну, давайте как бы вернемся к простой вещи.
If we come back to a very simple thing.
Я, конечно, понимаю, что как бы каждый человек, он имеет право на собственное мнение.
I do understand that every human being has a right to have his own opinion.
И я с глубоким уважением отношусь ко всем своим коллегам во всем мире.
And I have a very much deep respect to all my colleagues around the world.
И, в общем-то, я уже говорил на одной из панелей здесь, если вы хотите послушать что-то про криминологию, то вы можете, в принципе, кого угодно послушать.
And in one of the panels, I have already mentioned that if one would like to just to listen something about the topic, about the mentality or the criminality, we can listen to anybody if it's just listening about the subject.
То есть я не верю в гипотезы, которые кто-то выдвигает и ничего при этом не делает.
I'm not an adherent and I don't believe into hypotheses that are set by people and when nothing is done on those hypotheses or it's not proven by actions.
То есть, по сути своей, как бы очень жаль, что на этой панели нет моего друга Антонио Никаса.
It's very unfortunate that this panel is not attended by my close friend Antonio Nicaso.
Он бы привел несколько примеров, ну я это сделаю за него, что если вытащить криминальные деньги из экономики Европы на сегодняшний день, то она рухнет.
He would have given several examples, but I'll do that instead of him. That right now, if we would take away that criminal money from the global economy, then the global economy would collapse in a second.
Как на островах королевы, принадлежащей королеве Великобритании, отмываются деньги Дрангеты.
For instance, not many people know how on the islands that belong to the Queen of Great Britain, how they do the money laundering.
И так далее, и тому подобное. То есть, как бы, по сути своей, как бы, люди, которые выдвигают гипотезы и потом ничего не делают, мне слабо верится в том, что эти гипотезы работают.
So there are this real life, like astonishing examples. And so that is why I don't believe into those hypotheses that are set by people around the world. And when nothing is done to prove those hypotheses, probably they do not work.
То есть, если вы исследуете преступников, находящихся в тюрьме, это ничего не дает.
Because one studies the criminals that are in the prison, we won't get any desired outcome.
О, Билл, ты сидишь в тюрьме, ну расскажи мне, почему ты стал преступником?
So let's imagine a situation. We say, hey, Bill, you're imprisoned. Could you please share why did you become a criminal?
Конечно, я сейчас тебе все расскажу. Прямо вот, ну, ты подожди 5 минут, я тебе сейчас все расскажу. Прямо.
And he says, yeah, of course, please give me 5 minutes and I'll just tell you everything why I did become a criminal and why I'm sitting in this cell.
Но кроме улыбки это ничего не вызывает.
However, it doesn't solicit anything but a smile.
Да, вы же прекрасно понимаете, что преступность надо изучать тогда, когда она на свободе, а не когда она, извините, в тюрьме сидит.
So certainly, we're supposed to study the criminality when it's in the freedom and not when it's already imprisoned.
И именно поэтому я никогда не изучал преступников, которые сидят в тюрьме.
And that is the reason I have never studied the criminals that are in the prison.
А преступников, которые находятся на свободе, я изучаю по сей день.
And as for the criminals that are in the freedom right now, I still study them even to this day.
И я вас уверяю, что эти люди сильно отличаются от тех, которые сидят в тюрьме.
And I mean, I can bet that these people that are not in prison, they are very, very different than from those who are in prison.
И я понимаю, конечно, что преступников, находящихся на свободе, исследовать очень сложно, потому что это опасно, во-первых.
And obviously, it is very formidable to study criminals that are outside for many reasons. First of all, it is dangerous.
И еще опаснее противостоять этой преступности открыто.
And it's even more dangerous to resist, to deal with that criminality in an open manner.
И еще сложнее как бы противостоять, не будучи государственным служащим.
And it's even more complicated to resist them not being a government official.
То есть, когда ты не защищен государством.
When you do not have governmental protection.
Но такая наша работа криминологов.
But that's our job of criminologists.
Да, именно в этом и заключается наша работа, чтобы изучать преступников, которые на свободе, и изучать их очень качественно.
The main point of the profession of a criminologist is to study criminals that are outside and do it well.
И когда мы с вами говорим о такой проблеме, как преступность, безусловно, у этой преступности есть и мать, и отец, и как бы прочие как бы причины.
And certainly when we speak about the criminality itself, it has its own causes, it has its own origin, figuratively speaking, it has its mother and father.
Когда-то в Неаполе снимали фильм про Каморру.
One time, at one point of time in Naples, they were shooting a film about Camorra.
И он есть на английском языке, посмотрите его, пожалуйста, это ихняя там неаполитанская организованная преступность.
Это Гоморра, да?
Каморра, это документальный фильм, это не Гоморра.
So I'm speaking about the documentary, which is Camorra, not Gomorrah. So it is available in English.
И по сути своей, послушайте, что они говорят.
And if you closely listen to what they say in that documentary.
Если бы правительство нам дало работу, мы бы не были преступниками.
If the government would have provided us jobs, then we would not have been criminals.
Ну, отлично, вот куча мусора, уберите его, мы вам заплатим деньги.
All right, let's hypothetically imagine here you have a bunch of trash. Why don't you clean it up and you will have a job, you will receive some money.
Мы не можем убрать мусор, потому что это ниже нашего собственного достоинства.
And they reply, we cannot collect garbage because that's, it harms our dignity.
То есть вот это и есть мышление преступника.
And this is the mindset of a criminal.
То есть из этого мышления рождается вся преступность.
And all criminality stems from this type of the mindset because cleaning the garbage lowers their dignity and self-esteem.
То есть человек, который считает, что ему кто-то что-то должен, он уже преступник.
Because a person who truly, sincerely believes that everybody owes him something, he is already in the mindset of a criminal.
То есть человек, который хочет жить за счет кого-то, он уже преступник.
A person who would want to create his own future at the expense of somebody else so that somebody else, does that hard job for him, he is in a criminal mindset.
Просто делать и говорить – это разные вещи совершенно.
Because to do and to say these things are different things.
И когда мы начинаем говорить, что причин преступности может быть множество, кому это выгодно?
And when we say that there are a lot of causes of criminality, why don't we think to whom it is advantageous that we think that way?
У преступности три причины. Структура общества.
We list the exact reasons of why criminality exists. In simple words, the first one, the structure of the society.
Государственная политика.
Governmental policy, politics.
И система воспитания, принятая в обществе.
And the model of nurturing children, which is accepted in the society.
На этих трех слонах стоит вся преступность в мире.
And the entire global criminality stands on these three things, just like on pillars.
И, конечно, со мной можно спорить, но когда я задаю вопрос, как в центре Евросоюза находятся самые три могущественные преступные группировки в мире, мне никто не может ответить на этот вопрос.
And certainly people might argue with me till the end very actively. However, when I ask a question, how come in the center of European Union we have extremely powerful organized crime that nobody can deal with, nobody can do anything with, people cannot answer that question.
21 век.
It's 21st century.
Вы что, не знаете, что нужно делать?
Is it the fact that people don't know what to do?
Да там работы, я не знаю, на 2 месяца.
It is a work, 2 months work to resolve things out.
Не знаю, может, полгода это потолок.
Maybe 6 months, but it's a maximum amount of time to deal with the situation.
А почему за все это время никто эту работу не проделал?
But why nobody did this job in the course of such a long period of time?
А я вам скажу, почему. Потому что это никому не нужно.
And the answer is because nobody wants, nobody needs that organized crime to disappear.
Потому что эти три организации – это основа экономики Европы.
Because those three organizations play the role, they became the foundation of European economy.
Вот и все. То есть структура общества, государственная политика и система воспитания – это три вещи, которые не дают ликвидировать эти три преступные организации.
So it all stems down to the first structure of the society, the way it is right now. Second, the governmental policy, and the third, the system of upbringing. These three things do not allow to liquidate criminality.
Я не буду говорить об американском криминале, потому что я только начинаю изучать американский криминал.
I won't be talking about American criminality because I'm just in the beginning of depth study of it.
И мне сам по себе американский криминал не интересен, мне интересен военный криминал американский.
And I would be interested as a scholar, not in the American everyday life criminality, but in the military criminality.
Да, то есть меня интересуют вот эти товарищи. А вот что касается Европы и бывшего советской и восточноевропейской преступности, могу сказать точно, ничто так не формирует преступность, как государственная политика, структура общества и система воспитания, принятая в обществе.
And so these three things that I have mentioned that nurture criminality, I'm quite sure, I'm quite confident that those things nurture criminality is nothing else on the European territory, on the post-Soviet Union. And to repeat them once again, the structure of the society, the governmental policy, and the system of upbringing.
И когда мы говорим о конфликте семьи и города, сельской местности и города, символа семьи и символа города.
And when we speak about this conflict between the rural area and the urban area, in other words, aspiration of a human being to become a symbol of his city or the symbol of the city.
Это только то, что формирует уличную преступность.
That level is something that forms only this street, a very petty level of crime.
И с ней как раз полиция и борется.
And the police structures, they deal with that level of crime.
А два остальных уровня преступности, они недоступны для полиции.
And as for those two other levels of crime, they are not accessible by police structures.
С ними никто не позволит бороться.
Nobody would allow us to fight them, those two levels.
И это должно быть понятно.
And that should be obvious.
И если мы когда-то хотим добиться какого-то общества без преступности, нам нужно менять и структуру общества, и государственную политику, и систему воспитания. Я закончил. Спасибо за внимание.
And if we ever would want to live in the world without criminality, then we would have to completely change the structure of the society that we have today. The system of upbringing, which is accepted by the society to be normal, and the governmental policies. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maltsev, for delivering your speech. And let me please give the floor to Jim Finkenauer. You're welcome, Professor, and please turn on your mic.
Thank you. Okay, I will try to be brief. Thinking about cities and relationship to criminal behavior causes me to think about the differences between urban and rural and suburban areas. And one of those differences is that cities tend to be much more heterogeneous than, say, rural areas, which are more homogeneous. And I say that having grown up in a very small town and actually living in a neighborhood in which almost all the people living in my neighborhood were related. So there was a sharing of values and a sharing of what was regarded as being normative behavior. This is very different than growing up and living in a city where you have people who bring different values and different norms of behavior to that particular setting in which they are living. And you're more likely to get culture clashes as a consequence of people bringing in those different attitudes and different behaviors and different norms and so on. There's not a commonality or an agreed upon set of attitudes and behaviors and norms. It's also the reality that crowding increases stress and tension. I mean, if anybody will ever, not now during the pandemic, but say before the pandemic, anybody riding at rush hour on the subway system in New York City knows that it can be stressful and that a lot of tension arises out of it. This is cities in general. You got people rushing from one place to another, and there's like go, 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 and a lot of stress around that. Whereas in rural areas, you're much less likely to have that kind of situation. The suburbs, of course, are somewhere in the middle. And as mentioned by Professor, I won't try his last name, Finn, there are different kinds of crime. There's street crime, which is the kind that a lot of us, including myself, were talking about. But the kind of crime he's talking about is not the kind of crime you're likely to see in the suburbs. You're likely to see more behind closed door, what they call, we used to call the difference between crime in the streets and crime in the suites. And it's those suburban areas where you're more likely to see the latter than the former. So cities have the crowding, they have the tension, they have the stress. Also, cities have greater opportunities. They have greater opportunities to do good things, but also to do bad things. So you get a lot more criminal opportunities in cities than you do in rural areas. You got greater anonymity. In my little town, my little neighborhood, highly unlikely that anybody was going to victimize anybody else because everybody knew each other. It was so you couldn't rationalize what you were doing, that this was not hurting somebody, and so on. In the city, you got strangers, so you can take advantage of strangers. These are not your friends and your neighbors and your colleagues. These are strangers, and so therefore much more likelihood and justification for engaging in criminal behavior. You also have greater availability of drugs in cities, for example, than you do in rural areas. And that we know that that's a factor in criminal behavior. And the families, it's more difficult, I think, for families in urban areas than it is in rural areas. And you see often, I mentioned that I'd worked with kids in a juvenile correctional institution. These kids, a lot of these kids had joined gangs because the gangs were a replacement for their families. They got the kind of social support and recognition and so on from being a member of a gang that they didn't get in their family. So they became the family, if you will, of the gang kid, and the kid took on the values and the roles and the status of the gang. If I could just switch the topic, but because I was very interested in Professor Samonow's discussion about choice. I had a colleague at Rutgers, in fact, he's still at Rutgers, who had a theory about crime called the rational choice theory. And in a nutshell, what it says is that criminals make rational choices. They weigh the costs and the benefits of engaging in a crime, and they make a choice to engage in the crime. And I think that there's truth to that. But another colleague from Rutgers and myself did a study of the sex trafficking of Chinese women. And we interviewed many of these women who had been sex trafficking victims. And we asked them how they got involved in this and how this came about. And many of these women had, to some degree, exercised choice. But it wasn't an open, free, across the board kind of rational choice that my Rutgers colleague was talking about. These are women that came from very poor backgrounds. They came from backgrounds where they had very few other options. And what we call this bounded rationality. So that is it a rational choice? Yes. Do they have some agency in making that choice? Yes. But they were severely constrained and severely limited in terms of the other options that were available to them. And I think you could take that example and multiply it to other situations. Sure, criminals are making choices, but what are their options from which they're making those choices, and what are the rewards and benefits out of those choices? With that, I'll cease. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you. And right away, we are giving the floor to our next speaker, Professor Stanton Samino. You're welcome.
Thank you. I will make this brief, and unfortunately, I do have to leave you at 4 o'clock. So let me just say this, that from my years of research and being an expert witness and interviewing hundreds of criminals from different backgrounds, the same mentality underlies these people, no matter where they're from, and no matter what kind of crime they've committed. It isn't the law that's the critical thing here. Laws may change. I remember a man who said, "Doctor, if rape were legalized today, I wouldn't rape, but I'd do something else." One of our panelists used the example in the United States of the Me Too movement. Harvey Weinstein may not have been labeled a criminal, but he was a criminal even before he was prosecuted, even before the women came forward, because he inflicted injury on others. He victimized other people. So my expanded definition of criminality, it isn't a matter of getting caught or the particular laws at the time. I want to use the example also of because this was referred to earlier, the corporate executive who wants higher status and crosses a line to get there. It isn't the corporation or the setting that made him do it. There are plenty of people who are in very high positions in companies, and they use those positions to benefit the companies. Their status is based on merit and their contributions. They would not dream of embezzling from their corporations or bending the law. However, the person with a criminal mentality, when he achieves a high position, he uses that position to build himself up even further. That is to do what others won't do. His power, his control that he has as an executive, he is now able to misuse. So it wasn't the power that corrupted him. He was corrupt to begin with, and he misused the power that he had. Police officer, the same thing. Most police officers use the power and authority they have legitimately. But if you take some of the people I've dealt with, who from the time they were young, they wanted to be a law enforcement officer. Why? It was the excitement, the power, the control, the going after the bad guys, having the gun. So it wasn't being a law enforcement that corrupted them. They had this mentality before they ever became police officers. So again, I want to emphasize what is critical is thinking. What I'm saying to you right now, my behavior is a result of my thoughts. Crime is a product of how a person thinks. Choices are made all along the way. And I will stop with that.
Thank you for a brief and informative speech, Professor Samenow. So right away, I'm giving the floor to our next speaker, Majlergaard. You're welcome, sir.
With the microphone on, thank you very much. And thank you very much for your comments, Stanton. I think we disagree in one point. You're talking about a personal choice, whether a person decides to become a criminal, where I'm saying, and you're absolutely right, that some corporations don't have a criminal culture, while other corporations do have. But my point is that it lies in the culture of each corporation, whether it develops and accepts a criminal behavior or not. Of course, there are personal choices inside that as well. But if you have a corporation where criminal or semi-criminal behavior is the norm and accepted behavior, it's very, very difficult for an individual to resist that. But we can take that discussion another time. What I would like to briefly touch on here is the subject about cities versus rural areas, what defines it and what creates a criminal mindset. Jim, you touched on that as well, that when you are in a city, you are in a very complex cultural structure where the culture is very intransparent and there's so many different subcultures blending in together. So when you're coming from outside, coming from the rural areas, it can be very difficult to find out who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. We have seen that a lot, especially in emerging markets, where there's been a huge migration from the rural areas into the urban areas because they thought they could get a better life there. And we have also seen that some of the young people moving from the rural areas into the urban areas, that they're turning their back on their rural areas and say, I don't want to be like my parents. I don't want to grow rice. I don't want to have that life. I want a better life. And the people that they're looking up to, the people they see flashing the big cars, flashing the nice jewelries and the expensive watches, many of those people, they are not the good guys. They are the bad guys. So when you're coming from outside and don't understand the culture and don't understand how things work in the cities compared to the rural life, it's so easy to be dragged into a criminal or semi-criminal environment. Also in the cities, the different subcultures are very competitive. And for each individual, you're in a very competitive environment when you are in a city, especially when you're coming as a young person from outside. You want to show your people back home, you want to show your peers and the people you hang out with that you are doing well. So the temptations to do something criminal is very, very high compared to if you're living in the rural areas. And we have seen a huge migration from the countryside to the urban cities, to the urban areas over the past 40 years. And I think it was about 5 years ago, we passed the 50% mark where more than 50% of the world's population lives in big cities. Of course, that creates a lot of clashes, and it creates a lot of foundation for criminal activity because it is so competitive. Another thing is, which we have worked a lot with, is the relationship between identity and violence, and what kind of identities are built up, and when we're stereotyping upon each other. When I'm pointing, if you're pointing fingers at someone, a group of people, for instance, and blaming them for things are bad in a society, it's so easy for that group of people who are pointing fingers at to feel offended, and they want to have revenge over the people who are pointing fingers. I want to point out one book here which I like a lot. Oh, you can't see here because I have a background, but it's Amartya Sen's Identity and Violence. I don't know if you have read it, but he won the Nobel Prize in Economics in '98, I think. And he's really up against Samuel P. Huntington, who wrote the paper, The Clash of Civilizations, and where he said that all the conflicts we would have would be along the fault lines of these civilizations. I totally agree with Samuel P. Huntington. That is bullshit. Excuse my French. Because we have so many different identities, not only the national identities or continental identities. Each of us has plenty of identities based on our upbringing, gender, social class we belong to, educational level, and so on. So it's much more complex than that. And then we have, on one hand, we have politicians who can only build a power base by pointing out groups as being the reason for all the bad things that we are experiencing. But we have a choice, and that's what I really like about Samuel P. Huntington, is saying that with all these cultures coming together, especially in big cities, we actually have an active choice whether we want to promote the conflict or we want to promote the collaboration. And it's our choice. But what I feel, I don't know about you guys, but what I feel is that our biggest enemy in order to achieve some kind of peace and some kind of reconciliation, it is the politicians. Thank you very much.
So, dear colleagues, let me kindly remind you that this is the international conference, and as far as the cursive words are concerned, or obsessive words, they are not allowed here. Still, this is just a note for everyone to be remarked. However, we're discussing a very diverse, specific topic, and we have one more speaker to express his viewpoints and perspectives, and this is Professor Maxim Lepskiy. You're welcome. Микрофон.
Спасибо за предоставленное слово. Вот по отношению ко второму вопросу хотелось бы остановиться на следующих тезисах.
Thank you for giving me the floor. And as far as the second discussion point is concerned, I would like to share several theses.
Первый тезис связан с трансформирующими событиями.
The first thesis is connected with so-called transforming events or situations.
Поскольку город является основной сборкой символической и лучшей жизни, и образа жизни людей,
Since the city is that very environment that provides the best and the most effective and symbolic interconnection of the better life for people,
50 ключевых мегаполисов обладает большим процентом финансовой состоятельностью мира.
and as a matter of fact, let me say 50 megapolis, they actually do provide the better financial background and environment for people.
Чаще всего города являются центром притяжения миграционных процессов.
And usually the big cities are the attracting centers for migrants coming, for migrating process.
Что изучал и наш президент Джерри Крас.
And these tendencies, of course, was searched and researched by our president, Jerome Krase.
Когда Мы говорим о трансформирующих событиях, мы говорим о войне, революции, пандемии и терроризме.
So, Professor Lepskiy is mentioning so-called transforming or shaping and reshaping events. By this, we're speaking about the war, the revolution, the pandemic.
И современная тенденция ограничения перемещения людей связана прежде всего с пандемией.
And the contemporary tendency of, let me say, not allowing people to migrate or to go or to travel to the places they wish to is actually dedicated to the pandemics.
Что абсолютно неинтересно криминалу.
And of course, this is definitely not interesting for criminal.
Поскольку границы перемещает криминал перемещается через границы вполне эффективно.
This is definitely not about the criminal activity, since they don't care whether it is any pandemics or not. They effectively move abroad. They effectively move from one territory to the other, no matter what.
Подобно этому и военные конфликты на границах, например, подобно нашему конфликту на Донбассе.
Moreover, analyzing certain war conflict on the boundaries, especially on the state boundaries, and right now Professor Lepskiy is referring to a conflict in Donbass.
Создает совершенно другой профиль криминала в близлежащих территориях.
Of course, such huge tendencies, they reshape another type of criminal profile of the neighboring territories.
В современных глобальных процессах мы видим существенное перемещение людей со своими ценностями, нормами и идентичностями, создает новые точки разлома и криминала в более обеспеченных странах.
And moreover, analyzing the migration processes or the processes of people relocating to the other countries, and when they relocate, they also bring their personal views, their personal values, etc. And by this, these migration processes also serve as the breaking points to the mindset of criminality and to the methods they are going to use.
Но меняется и профиль криминала в серой зоне, которая не очень обеспечена, но которая находится в приграничной части с обеспеченными странами.
And moreover, of course, we are, let me say, we are always to see the difference in a criminal activity between in different countries, like countries they are serving on the high financial budget and those that are living in the poverty.
Поэтому, на мой взгляд, сейчас очень интересная тема – это сопротивляемость или резистентность города по отношению к новым воздействиям и вызовам криминала.
And of course, one of the most interesting and significant things to be researched is all about the social resistance to the criminal activity. How is it shaped?
Поэтому у нас сейчас актуализированы и исследования макросоциологии.
And of course, the social tendencies research on the macro level are relevant these days.
Хотя в социологии города мы чаще все-таки исследовали микросоциологические и социологии среднего уровня исследования.
And this is a huge shift since previously we were researching the city sociology from the micro level or the major level.
И в этом направлении, мне кажется, системное исследование с универсальными подходами, которые предложены в том числе и Европейской академией наук Украины, на мой взгляд, являются передовыми.
And from the personal viewpoint of Professor Maxim Lepskiy, the methodology, the approaches, the methods and systems of research, as well as the research how to counteract and how to deal with this criminal activity or researching the criminality aspects that are approved and verified by the scholars of European Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. They are one of the most effective, and they're one of those that should be applied.
Спасибо коллегам за очень интересную панель дискуссии.
And once again, thank you so much, dear colleagues, for one of the most peculiar, for the brightest, for this, even let me say, wonderful discussion and for this wonderful session. So by this, all the speakers shared their viewpoints, shared their perspectives, and I believe this is the high time we've closed our online panel. So let me thank all the speakers, colleagues, and experts. So this is day number 5 of the International Conference, The Role of Mentality in Human Life and Culture, arranged by the European Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. So tomorrow, we are going to face the finishing online panel of this wonderful and brilliant conference. And by this, let me once again thank you and say, see you soon. See you tomorrow. Be safe.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you for participating. It was a great discussion.
Thank you so much.